November 14, 1840, Western Carolina Territory 3 miles south of the Hiwassee River, where the pines grow so thick the sun barely touches the ground. A woman named Aida stands in the doorway of a burning cabin, her hands black with soot and red with blood, watching 5 men scream as the flames swallow them whole. The air smells like scorched flesh and vengeance. History will not remember her name in the textbooks of conquerors, but the earth remembers, because on this night a mother became a myth, and 5 devils learned that some souls cannot be bought, broken, or buried. This is not a story of justice. Justice had abandoned the Cherokee long before Andrew Jackson signed their death warrant in ink and called it law. This is a story of what happens when a mother is given a choice between her daughter's life and her own soul, and chooses both, with fire as her witness. The men in that cabin were slave traders, traffickers of stolen children, merchants of misery who moved through the Carolina backwoods like wolves in human skin. They had taken her daughter, Enola, that morning at dawn. By midnight, none of them would leave that forest alive. The world has spent centuries telling us that women like Aida were victims, silent, helpless, erased. But if you stay with this story, if you let it burn its way into your memory the way fire burns through wood, you will know the truth that the most dangerous thing in this world has always been a mother with nothing left to lose. Subscribe now, not for comfort, but for the reckoning. Comment if you understand that some histories are written not in ink, but in ash and blood. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. Aida was 32 years old the morning they came for her daughter, though age had carved itself into her face the way a river carves stone. Slowly, relentlessly, leaving marks that told stories no words could carry. She was born in the old Cherokee Nation, before the maps were redrawn by men who had never walked the land they claimed to own. Her mother had taught her the language of herbs and roots, how to read the forest like a book written in green and shadow. Her father had taught her to survive, not just to live, but to endure when living became a form of warfare. By the time she was 15, she had watched soldiers burn her village. By 20, she had buried her husband after he died from fever and exhaustion on the Trail of Tears, that forced march of death they dressed up with the word removal, as if you could remove a people from their bones, their breath, their sacred ground. She had survived it all. She had learned that survival was not the same as submission. Enola was 17, beautiful in the way dawn is beautiful, brief, radiant, impossible to hold. She had her father's eyes, dark and deep as river water, and her grandmother's voice, soft but strong, the kind of voice that could sing a child to sleep or call a storm down from the mountains. Aida had raised her alone in a cabin they built with their own hands, hidden deep in the woods where the government agents rarely wandered, where they could pretend, for a few stolen years, that the world had forgotten them. Enola gathered wild ginger and sang old songs. She wove baskets so tightly they could hold water. She did not know, could not have known, that men were watching, that there were traders who moved through these forests with lists and prices, who saw Cherokee girls not as human beings but as merchandise, exotic, young, profitable. They sold them to brothels in Charleston, to plantations in Georgia, to anyone willing to pay for flesh that could be worked, used, discarded. Enola's only crime was being beautiful and vulnerable in a world that devoured both. The men arrived at dawn, when the mist still clung to the ground like a shroud, and the world was caught between darkness and light. There were 5 of them. Aida would remember each face with the clarity of a curse, the kind of memory that burns itself into the mind and never fades. The leader was a man named Dalton Creech, a former overseer from a tobacco plantation in Virginia who had found more profit in stealing people than in watching them work. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if cruelty hadn't twisted it into something reptilian. His eyes were pale blue, empty of anything resembling mercy. He wore a long coat despite the heat, and beneath it, a pistol and a coil of rope. He smiled when he spoke, as if trafficking in human lives was a business transaction no different from selling cattle or corn. Beside him stood 2 brothers, Virgil and Clem Hodge, both squat and thick-necked, with hands like slabs of meat and minds to match. They did the dirty work, the grabbing, the binding, the beating when necessary. They had been doing this for years, moving through Cherokee territory like scavengers, picking off the isolated, the unprotected, the ones the world had already decided didn't matter. They spoke in grunts and laughter, the kind of laughter that comes easy to men who have never been held accountable for anything in their lives. Then there was Silas Kern, thin and wary, with a face like a weasel and a knife he kept too sharp and too clean. He was the tracker, the one who found the cabins hidden deep in the woods, who followed smoke trails and footprints, who studied patterns and reported back. And finally, there was a man they called Preacher, though Aida doubted he had ever set foot in a church that would have him. He quoted scripture while he worked, twisted Bible verses into justifications for atrocity, as if God himself had signed off on their trade. He carried a leather-bound book in one hand and a club in the other, and he used both with equal conviction. They came with no warning, no negotiation, no pretense of law. Aida was outside when they emerged from the tree line, gathering water from the creek that ran cold and clear behind the cabin. She saw them before they saw her. 5 shadows moving with purpose through the morning fog, and her heart understood what her mind did not want to accept. She dropped the clay pot. It shattered against the stones, water spilling into the moss like an omen. She ran, not away from the cabin but toward it, because Enola was inside, still asleep, still dreaming whatever innocent dreams a girl might dream in the last moments before the world becomes a nightmare. Aida's feet pounded against the earth, her breath tearing through her lungs, but they were faster. Clem Hodge caught her at the door, his thick arm wrapping around her waist and lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing. She screamed. She clawed at his face, drew blood, felt his skin tear beneath her nails, but he only laughed. A deep, phlegmy sound that came from somewhere dark and rotten inside him. Dalton Creech kicked the cabin door open with one boot. The sound split the morning like an axe through wood. Enola woke to the sight of strange men in her home, their faces lit by the dim firelight that still burned in the hearth from the night before. She did not scream. She froze, her body understanding faster than her mind that movement might mean death. Creech crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her by the hair, yanking her from the bed so hard her neck snapped back and tears sprang to her eyes. "Pretty thing," he said, his voice low and appraising, as if he were examining livestock. "She'll fetch a good price in Charleston. Maybe even Savannah if we clean her up." Enola's eyes found her mother's through the doorway, and in that look was every goodbye, every apology, every prayer that would go unanswered. Aida fought like a demon. She bit Clem's arm until she tasted copper. She kicked backward, felt something crack, maybe his shin, maybe his knee. But Virgil was there then and Silas, and together they held her down in the dirt. They bound Aida's wrists with rough hemp rope that cut into her skin, tied so tight her fingers began to go numb within minutes. Virgil pressed his knee into her spine, forcing her face into the cold mud while Silas secured the knots with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times before. She could hear Enola crying inside the cabin, could hear Dalton Creech's voice, smooth and patient, explaining to her daughter in grotesque detail what her life would become. "You'll work in a house in Charleston," he said. "Fine house. Rich men. You'll learn to smile, learn to serve, learn to survive. Or you won't. Either way, we get paid." The preacher stood in the doorway watching it all with his dead eyes, murmuring something that might have been Corinthians or might have been his own twisted invention. "The Lord giveth," he whispered, "and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of prophet." They dragged Enola outside. She was wearing only her nightdress, thin cotton that clung to her body in the morning cold. Her feet were bare, already bleeding from the rough ground. Creech had her by the arm, his grip bruising, proprietary. Enola's eyes were wide not with fear yet, but with disbelief, the kind of shock that comes when the world reveals itself to be more evil than you ever imagined possible. She looked at her mother, still pinned in the dirt, and said the only thing she could think to say, "Mama, I'm sorry," as if any of this were her fault, as if beauty were a sin she had committed, as if being born Cherokee in a world ruled by men like these were something she should apologize for. Aita felt something break inside her then, not her spirit but something deeper, some final tether to the person she had been, the woman who believed in patience, in endurance, in waiting for a justice that never came. "Let her go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, dirt in her mouth. Creech laughed. "Or you'll curse us?" He spat on the ground near her face. "Your curses don't work no more. Your gods are dead." They left Aida tied to a tree at the edge of the clearing, bound so tightly she could barely breathe, let alone move. Creech wanted her to watch, he said. Wanted her to understand the cost of resistance, the price of being born into a people the world had already decided to erase. "You'll stay here," he told her, crouching down so his face was level with hers, his breath sour with tobacco and rot. "You'll watch us take her. And when we're far enough away that your screaming won't matter, maybe we'll let you loose, maybe. Or maybe the wolves will find you first." He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and walked back toward the cabin where his men were loading supplies. Aita's herbs, her dried meat, the few possessions she and Enola had managed to accumulate in their years of hiding. They took everything, not because they needed it, but because they could. Because taking was what men like them did. Enola sat in the dirt near the cabin door, her hands bound in front of her, her face streaked with tears and mud. Virgil stood over her, cleaning his nails with the tip of his knife, humming some tuneless melody that made Aita's stomach turn. Clem was inside, ransacking the place, throwing what he didn't want into the fireplace and laughing as it burned. Silas had disappeared into the woods, scouting the trail they would take south, marking trees, erasing any trace of their presence. And the preacher sat on a stump reading his Bible aloud in a monotone voice, as if sanctifying the abduction with scripture. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood," he droned, "but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world." Aita wondered if he understood the irony, or if men like him were incapable of seeing themselves as the darkness they claimed to fight. The sun climbed higher. The mist burned away, and Aita, bound to that tree, felt something ancient and terrible waking inside her. Not hope, because hope was a luxury for people who still believed the world could be reasoned with. This was something older. Something that predated law, predated mercy, predated every lie civilization told itself about order and justice. It took her 3 hours to free herself. 3 hours of twisting her wrists inside the rope until the hemp was slick with her own blood. 3 hours of working the knots against the rough bark of the tree, feeling the skin peel away from her hands in strips, ignoring the pain because pain was irrelevant now. Pain was just another language her body spoke, and she had learned long ago to stop listening. The men had grown careless in their confidence. They assumed she was beaten, broken, that a woman alone and bound was no threat at all. They had made the mistake that men like them always made. They had confused her silence for submission, her stillness for surrender. They did not know that Cherokee women were taught from childhood that survival was an art form, that patience was a weapon, that rage could be stored like grain in a silo and released when the moment was right. When the rope finally gave way, she did not run. She stood slowly, her legs shaking from hours of constricted blood flow, her hands screaming with fresh agony. She looked down at her wrists, raw meat and exposed tendon, and felt nothing. The part of her that would have wept at such injury had died the moment they dragged Enola from the cabin. What remained was something harder, colder, more deliberate. She moved through the clearing like a ghost, gathering what she needed. The men had left behind an axe, half buried in a stump where Clem had been splitting firewood that morning. She pulled it free. The handle was worn smooth from use, the blade still sharp. She tested its weight, felt its balance, and understood that this tool, meant for building and survival, would now be repurposed for something else entirely. She knew where they were going. There was only one trail south through this part of the forest, one route that avoided the government checkpoints and the main roads where questions might be asked. It led to an old trapper's cabin, abandoned for years, where men like Dalton Creech could rest for the night before continuing to Charleston. She had passed it once, years ago, and remembered its location the way you remember the site of a grave. She would go there. She would find them. And she would make them understand what it meant to take a child from a mother who had already lost everything else. The forest knew her. It had always known her. As she moved through the trees, the earth seemed to guide her steps, roots curving away from her path, branches parting like curtains. The Cherokee believed that the land held memory, that the mountains and rivers and ancient oaks remembered every footstep, every prayer, every drop of blood spilled upon them. If that was true, then these woods remembered her people. The villages that once stood here, the children who played in these creeks, the elders who walked these trails before soldiers came with fire and orders. The forest remembered, and it recognized her purpose. Birds went silent as she passed. The wind stilled. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath, as if nature itself understood that what was coming was not murder, but reckoning. She walked for hours, her body moving on instinct and fury, her mind blank of everything except the image of Vanola's face. Those dark eyes wide with fear, that whispered apology that should never have been spoken. The axe grew heavy in her hand, but she did not put it down. She let the weight of it anchor her, let the ache in her shoulder remind her why she was walking, why she could not stop, why turning back was no longer an option. Her feet found the old trail, the one the trappers had used decades ago when beaver pelts were worth gold, and these mountains were still wild enough to hide a man who didn't want to be found. The path was overgrown now, choked with thorns and saplings, but it was still there, still leading south, still carrying her toward the abandoned cabin where 5 men thought themselves safe. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Aita did not stop to rest. She ate as she walked. Wild ramps she pulled from the ground, blackberries she stripped from bushes, anything to keep her body moving. She drank from streams without kneeling, cupping water to her mouth with her ruined hands, feeling the cold shock of it against her throat. Somewhere ahead, she knew they were laughing. They were eating the food they had stolen from her cabin. They were celebrating another successful hunt, another girl added to their inventory. They thought themselves clever, untouchable. They thought the world belonged to men like them. They were wrong. She reached the cabin just after nightfall. It sat in a small clearing, hunched and dark against the trees like a tumor on the landscape. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, thin and gray, carrying the smell of burning pine and cooked meat. Light flickered through the gaps in the shuttered windows. Firelight, warm and inviting to anyone who didn't know what kind of men sat inside. Aita crouched at the tree line, her body pressed against the rough bark of an oak, watching, listening. She could hear their voices, muffled but distinct, the rise and fall of conversation punctuated by laughter. Creech's voice, loud and boastful. The preacher's monotone murmur. The Hodge brothers grunting their approval at something. And beneath it all, silence from Enola. That silence told Aita everything she needed to know. She circled the cabin slowly, studying it the way a wolf studies a trap. It was old, built from rough, hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, the kind of structure that had survived decades through stubbornness alone. There was only one door facing east and 2 windows, both shuttered from the inside. The roof was wood shake, dried and brittle from years of sun and rain. She could see the mistakes in its construction, the gaps where the logs didn't quite meet, the places where weather had worn the chinking away, the way the whole structure leaned slightly to one side as if the earth were trying to reclaim it. She moved like smoke, silent and deliberate, until she stood at the back wall where the shadows were deepest. Through a gap in the logs, she could see inside. The 5 men sat around a crude table made from split logs and rope. They were drinking from a jug they passed between them, their faces flushed with alcohol and arrogance. Enola sat in the corner, bound to a support post, her head down, her hair falling across her face like a curtain. She was alive. That was all that mattered. Dalton Creech was talking, gesturing with his hands, telling some story that made the others laugh. probably about another girl, another family destroyed, another prophet made. The preacher nodded along, his Bible open on his lap, as if God himself were listening and approving. Aita's grip tightened on the axe. She felt her heartbeat slow, felt her breathing steady. This was not rage anymore. This was ceremony. She waited. Patience was the final weapon they had not accounted for, the one advantage they could not strip away with rope and cruelty. She waited until the jug had been passed around 3 more times, until their voices grew louder and their movements slower, until the fire in the hearth burned low and their attention dulled. She waited until Virgil Hodge stood stretched and announced he was going outside to piss. She watched him stumble toward the door, heard the scrape of the wooden latch, saw him step out into the night. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, unbuttoning his trousers, sighing with the relief of a man who thought himself safe, thought himself among friends, thought the night held nothing more dangerous than darkness. He never saw her coming. She moved from the shadows with the axe already raised, and before he could turn, before he could draw breath to shout, she brought it down across the back of his skull with every ounce of strength her body possessed. The sound was not loud, a dull, wet crack, like a branch breaking under snow. He dropped without a word, his body folding in on itself, collapsing into the dirt. Blood pooled black in the moonlight. Aita stood over him, breathing hard, waiting to feel something, remorse, horror, hesitation. She felt nothing except the certainty that this was right, that this was justice in the only form left to her, that if the world would not punish these men, then she would become the punishment herself. She dragged his body into the brush, moving quickly now, because time was a luxury she did not have. Inside the cabin, she could hear Clem calling out, annoyed, "Virgil, you fall in a hole out there. Get your ass back in here." Louder. The scrape of a chair. Footsteps approaching the door. Aita pressed herself against the side of the cabin, axe ready, heart pounding not with fear but with focus. The door opened. Clem stepped out, squinting into the darkness, irritated and drunk. "Virgil," he called, his voice thick. He took 2 steps forward, and then Aita was there, swinging the axe not at his head but at his knee, a brutal upward arc that shattered bone and tendon and dropped him screaming into the dirt. His scream shattered the night, and inside the cabin, the remaining 3 men finally understood that something had gone terribly wrong. Chaos erupted inside. She heard chairs scraping, boots pounding. Dalton Creech's voice barking orders. "Get the guns, now!" But Aita was already moving. She kicked the cabin door open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall and one of the leather hinges tore free. The 3 men spun toward her, Creech reaching for the pistol on the table, Silas Kern already holding his knife, the preacher stumbling backward with his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. For a single, frozen moment, they stared at her. At this Cherokee woman standing in the doorway, covered in blood that was not her own, holding an axe that dripped red onto the floorboards, her eyes containing something they had never seen before, because they had spent their entire lives as predators, and had forgotten that prey, when cornered, becomes something else entirely. Creech recovered first. He lunged for the pistol. Aita threw the axe. It spun end over end across the small room, a wheel of iron and wood and fury, and embedded itself in his chest with a sound like a butcher's cleaver hitting meat. He staggered backward, looking down at the handle protruding from his sternum with an expression of pure disbelief, and then his legs gave out and he collapsed against the table, dragging it down with him, scattering tin cups and playing cards and their stolen food across the floor. Silas moved next, fast and feral, his knife flashing in the firelight. He was quick, trained, dangerous. But Aita had spent 32 years surviving things that should have killed her, and fear had long since burned out of her system. She sidestepped his first thrust, caught his wrist, and used his own momentum to drive him forward into the stone hearth. His head connected with the edge with a crack that echoed through the cabin. He slumped, blood streaming from his temple, the knife clattering from his hand. She picked it up without thinking, the blade still warm from his grip. The preacher backed into the corner, his mouth moving in silent prayer, his eyes wide with the kind of terror he had inflicted on countless others, but had never experienced himself. "Please," he whispered. "I'm a man of God." Aita looked at him. This man who had quoted scripture while stealing children and felt something like pity, but pity changed nothing. "Your God is not here," Aita said, her voice steady, cold as the creek water she had gathered that morning in another lifetime. She moved toward him, the knife held loosely in her hand, and the preacher pressed himself against the wall as if he could merge with the wood and disappear. He raised his Bible like a talisman, his lips trembling through verses he had memorized but never understood. "The Lord is my shepherd," he stammered. "I shall not want." She slapped the book from his hands. It hit the floor and splayed open, pages fluttering like broken wings. "You quote scripture while you steal children," she said. "You speak of God while you serve the devil. If there is judgment coming, preacher, it starts tonight." Behind her, Clem was crawling through the doorway, dragging his shattered leg, leaving a trail of blood across the threshold. His face was white with shock and pain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was trying to reach the woods, trying to escape, still believing somehow that he might survive this. Aita heard him but did not turn. She kept her eyes on the preacher, watching him crumble, watching his faith reveal itself as the hollow thing it had always been. A costume worn to justify atrocity, a shield that worked only as long as no one struck back. Then she heard Enola's voice, small and broken. "Mima." Aita's head snapped toward the corner where her daughter sat bound to the post, and in that instant the preacher made his move. He lunged for the pistol still clutched in Dalton Creech's dead hand, his fingers scrabbling across the floor. Aita spun and drove the knife into his back, between the shoulder blades, angled upward toward the heart. He gasped, arched, went rigid. She twisted the blade and felt his body go slack. He slumped forward onto Creech's corpse. The two of them tangled together in death the way they had been tangled in life. Partners in cruelty, reunited in blood. Aita pulled the knife free and walked to her daughter. She cut the ropes with shaking hands, caught Enola as she collapsed forward, held her the way she had held her as an infant. Tightly, desperately, as if love alone could erase what had been done. "I'm here," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "I'm here. A pause here if you can bear it. Understand what you are witnessing. This is not a tale spun for comfort or entertainment. This is the kind of truth that gets buried beneath prettier histories. The kind of story that makes us uncomfortable because it forces us to confront what happens when the law becomes the enemy and justice must be taken by bleeding hands. If you are still here, still listening, then you understand that some stories demand to be remembered, not because they are easy, but because they are necessary. Subscribe to carry this memory forward. Comment if you know that history belongs not to the conquerors who write it, but to the mothers who survive it. Share this if you believe that legends are born not in moments of peace, but in the fires of righteous fury. Because the night is not over. 3 men are dead, but 2 remain. And what Aita does next will turn her from a woman into a myth, a ghost story whispered around fires, a warning carved into the bones of men who believe themselves untouchable. The reckoning has only begun. Enola clung to her mother, trembling, her body racked with sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. Aita held her, stroked her hair, whispered words in Cherokee that her own mother had whispered to her. Words of protection, of survival, of love that transcends every brutality the world can inflict. But even as she comforted her daughter, Aita's mind was calculating, measuring, planning. Because Clem was still alive, still crawling toward the tree line, and outside in the darkness, Virgil lay where she had left him. Either dead or dying, the work was not finished. It could not be finished until every man who had touched her daughter, who had dared to put a price on her life, had paid with his own. She pulled back, looked into Enola's eyes. "Stay here," she said. "Do not look, do not listen. Close your eyes and sing the old songs grandmother taught you. Sing until I come back." Enola's hands clutched at her mother's arms, desperate, terrified. "Mama, no, please. We can run. We can hide. We can." Aita placed her hand over her daughter's mouth, gentle but firm. "There is no hiding from men like these," she said. "They will always find us. They will always come, unless we make sure they cannot." She kissed Enola's forehead, tasting salt and fear and innocence that had been stolen but not yet destroyed. "Trust me, daughter. What I do now, I do so you never have to." She stood and walked back to the center of the cabin, to the carnage she had created. Dalton Creech lay dead, the axe still buried in his chest. Silas Kern was slumped against the hearth, unconscious or dead. She neither knew nor cared. The preacher sprawled across Creech's legs, his Bible soaking in their mingled blood. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but the walls were dry wood, old and brittle, seasoned by decades of sun and wind. Aita looked at those walls, at the roof above, at the structure that had sheltered these men while they planned their evil. And she understood, with perfect clarity, what needed to happen next. She walked to the hearth, knelt and began feeding the fire, not to warm herself, not for light, but to build an inferno. She fed the flames with everything she could find, the wooden chairs, shattered into kindling, the table legs, broken and splintered, the preacher's Bible, its pages curling and blackening as the fire consumed scripture and hypocrisy alike. She tore down the curtains that hung over the windows, ancient fabric that caught fire instantly, flaring bright and hungry. She poured the jug of whiskey across the floor, watched the flames race along the liquid trail like a living thing, blue and gold and furious. The fire grew. It climbed the walls, licked at the ceiling beams, filled the cabin with heat and smoke and the promise of total destruction. Silas Kern began to stir, coughing, his eyes fluttering open to find himself surrounded by flame. He tried to crawl, tried to drag himself toward the door, but his body would not obey. Aita watched him without expression, watched him realize what was happening, watched the terror bloom in his eyes as he understood that he would burn alive. She picked up Enola, her daughter light as feathers despite being nearly grown, and carried her out of the cabin into the cold night air. She set her down gently at the edge of the clearing, far enough from the growing inferno. "Stay here," she commanded, and Enola, too shocked to disobey, nodded mutely. Aita turned back toward the cabin, now fully engulfed, flames shooting through the roof, sparks spiraling up into the black sky like furious stars. Inside, she could hear Silas screaming. The sound was inhuman, animal, a noise no human throat should be able to make. It cut through the night, and then, suddenly, it stopped. Clem had dragged himself perhaps 20 feet from the cabin before his strength gave out. He lay on his stomach in the dirt, his ruined leg twisted at an impossible angle, his breath shallow and rapid. He heard her footsteps approaching and tried to crawl faster, his fingers clawing at the earth, pulling his body forward inch by agonizing inch. "Please," he gasped when she stood over him. "Please, I got a wife. I got children." Aita crouched beside him, her face illuminated by the firelight, beautiful and terrible as a war goddess. "So did the families you destroyed," she said. "Did you show them mercy?" He had no answer, only the desperate, pitiful whimpering of a man who had spent his life inflicting suffering and had never once imagined it might be returned. Aita grabbed him by the collar and began dragging him back toward the burning cabin. He screamed then, the same high-pitched wail of terror he had probably heard from countless victims, and it meant nothing to her. His weight was considerable, but rage gave her strength she did not know she possessed. She hauled him across the dirt through the smoke, right up to the doorway where the flames roared like a living mouth. The heat was immense, searing, almost unbearable, but she did not stop. She dragged him over the threshold and into the inferno. Clem Hodge's screams joined the chorus of crackling wood and collapsing timber. Aita backed away from the doorway, shielding her face from the heat, and watched as the flames consumed him. His body thrashed, silhouetted against the fire, a dark shape wreathing in orange hell, and then he went still. She turned away, not out of mercy, but because there was one more, Virgil. She found him where she had left him, still alive somehow, lying on his back in the brush, breathing in shallow, rattling gasps. Blood had pooled beneath his head, black and thick. His eyes were open, staring up at the stars, consciousness flickering in and out like a candle in wind. When he saw her standing over him, recognition sparked in his dying gaze. He tried to speak, but only blood came out, bubbling from his lips. Aita knelt beside him, her face close to his. "You came to my home," she said quietly, her voice almost tender, almost kind. "You put your hands on my daughter. You laughed while she cried. Do you remember laughing, Virgil?" He made a sound, something between a groan and a sob. "I want you to understand something before you die," she continued. "You and your brothers, you thought we were nothing, animals to be traded, bodies to be used and discarded. But we are the ones who will endure. We are the ones who remember. And long after your names are forgotten, my daughter will live. She will sing. She will have children of her own. You will be dust and ashes and less than nothing." She picked up a burning branch from the edge of the clearing, a piece of the cabin that had fallen away, still blazing at one end. She looked down at Virgil Hodge, this man who had helped destroy so many lives, and felt nothing but the cold finality of justice. "You will burn like your brothers," she said, "and the forest will forget you ever existed." She dropped the branch onto his chest. His clothes caught immediately, old fabric and dried sweat igniting in a rush of flame. He had no strength left to scream, no voice left to beg. His body convulsed once, twice, and then went still as the fire consumed him, erasing him from the world as thoroughly as he and his kind had tried to erase her people. Aita stood and walked back to where Enola waited, her daughter's face illuminated by the firelight, tears streaming down her cheeks. The cabin was fully engulfed now, the entire structure collapsing in on itself, sending columns of smoke and sparks into the night sky. The heat was so intense that the nearby trees had begun to smolder, their leaves curling and blackening. But the forest was damp from recent rain, and the fire would not spread beyond this clearing. It would burn itself out here in this place, consuming only what needed to be consumed. 5 men had entered this forest as predators. 5 men would leave as smoke and ash and cautionary tales. Aita took Enola's hand. Her daughter was shaking, traumatized, forever changed by what she had witnessed. But she was alive, she was free, and that was all that mattered. "We have to go," Aita said softly. "They will see the smoke come morning. People will come. We cannot be here." Enola nodded, unable to speak, unable to process everything that had happened in the span of a single night. They walked into the forest together, mother and daughter, leaving the burning cabin behind them. The flames cast their shadows long across the ground, 2 figures moving through darkness, silhouetted against an inferno that would burn until dawn. Behind them, the fire roared its approval. The wind carried the smoke south toward Charleston, toward the markets where human beings were bought and sold, toward the civilized world that had created men like Dalton Creech and the Hodge brothers and Silas Kern and the preacher. A message written in flame and fury some mothers cannot be broken. They say that on certain November nights, when the air grows cold and the mist clings to the Carolina mountains, you can still smell smoke in the woods south of the Hiwassee River. They say the trees there grow twisted and dark, as if the earth itself remembers what happened in that clearing in 1840, as if the land holds the memory of 5 men who thought themselves untouchable and 1 woman who proved them wrong. The history books do not mention Aita's name. They do not speak of Enola, or of the cabin that burned, or of the righteous fire that consumed men who trafficked in stolen children. The conquerors who wrote those histories had no interest in preserving stories that made heroes of Cherokee mothers and villains of white men. But the people remember. The descendants remember. The forest remembers. Aita and Enola disappeared into the mountains that night and were never seen again by the authorities who came searching. Some say they fled west, beyond the reach of the slave traders and the soldiers, into territories where the Cherokee still held some measure of freedom. Others say they went north, changed their names, lived quiet lives in towns where no one knew their story, and some, the ones who tell this tale in whispers late at night, when the fire burns low, say that Aita became something more than human after that November evening, that she transformed into a spirit of vengeance who walks the forest still, protecting Cherokee children from those who would do them harm, a ghost with an axe and eyes like burning coals. The truth is simpler and more profound. Aida was a mother who refused to let her daughter be stolen. She was a woman who understood that sometimes justice does not come from laws or governments or gods, but from the hands of those who have been pushed beyond endurance. She burned 5 men alive not because she was a monster, but because they were, and in doing so she carved her name not into stone or paper, but into the collective memory of a people who have survived every attempt to erase them. November 14, 1840, Western Carolina, a cabin burns, 5 devils die. 1 mother becomes legend, and the Cherokee remember, as they have always remembered, as they will always remember, that survival is not passive. It is a choice made with fire and blood and unbreakable will. This is her testimony. This is her truth. This is Aida.